Hello, I'm Dennis. I was asked to present a lecture on transitioning from APDA to BP. A little about myself. I competed a lot in both formats and did relatively well at both. And actually really enjoyed doing both and think that there's a lot of synergies between the two. So yeah, this is going to be like half pitched and then also like on why you should do BP, and then also half kind of explaining a bit about the differences between the two and helping people who might have never done BP make it seem more approachable, and give some tips on things to look out for when making that transition. So three things will be covered in today's lecture. First is the pitch. The second is talking a bit about the differences between BP and APDA. Then finally about the skills. Importantly, I'm not going to go into like the specific like rules of BP, like the speech times and all that. I'm going to assume that you have already like a general familiarity with like how the round breaks down. This is going to be more about kind of the differences and like norms and strategy, things like that. So first, why should you do BP? I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is I think it like, let's say you primarily care about APTA, BP is something you might do just because like you have like a free weekend, and it's online or something. So you're like, maybe I'll try it. But you still want to focus on APTA. Even then, I think that doing BP makes you better at APTA. And I have these images here of like Michael Phelps doing boxing or Jamal Murray doing MMA, because I want to stress that like, athletes in other sports at the top levels engage in cross training. They do other sports that stress other skills that are complementary with their primary sport. And I think BP just like is a very natural fit for people who very much want to get better at APTA. It stresses skills that sometimes are useful in APTA, but just doing rounds might not necessarily work on. So you can almost think of it as a drill. Things that I think it gets you better at are round vision, just getting better at doing motions APTA, given that I think an increasing number of tournaments are becoming motions. And then finally, just changing your argumentation to have a bit more of like a lay appeal, to be a bit more intuitive. I know, a lot of times people feel like a judge screwed them because they didn't understand an argument, or maybe the judge isn't particularly technical and your style is a much more technical APTA style. That being the case, you can't change who your judge is going to be, but you can change the way that you debate and adapt. And I think being able to be kind of flexible in that way is very much an advantage for someone who's trying to win more of their rounds, rather than just sulking and saying like, why doesn't my judge evaluate APTA rounds the exact way that I wish they would? Which, maybe is a more comforting narrative, but is not one that is conducive to getting better as a debater. And I think this is kind of just borne out in the empirics, right? So 5 out of the last 6 team of the years were teams that had at least one, but usually 2 people that were worlds breaking BP debaters. Multiple of the past couple SOTIs, even in recent APTA, were also people who are very talented BP debaters. The current SOTI, though that's still not decided, is also a very, very good BP debater. So at the very least, even if you don't buy that it is symbiotic, you should at least believe that being at one does not preclude being good at the other. And that, oftentimes these are people who had their start in APTA, didn't do very much to change their skill, and still performed quite well, right? So I think at the very least, it should at least make it seem less intimidating. But I actually do think that, if you do watch the styles of these debaters, you can see kind of the influences that BP can have at times. And then finally, like, even if you don't think that it is a useful, application of your time as a drill, I think that just as an activity, assuming that you're someone who does APTA because you find that activity fun, this is a similar sport that is also fun, right? Like, I think it is just worth trying, independent of whether it makes you better at the activity, just as doing something else, right? So if you were someone who plays chess, it could be useful to play checkers, not because, well, maybe not checkers, but like I don't know, like Civ 5 or something. Not because it makes you better at chess, but just because you are someone who enjoys the kind of, you know, uh, critical thinking, problem solving skills that debate invites. And this is just another avenue upon which you can exercise those skills, right? It's just another fun sport. If you like strategy games, it's just another strategy game for you to try. So some common misconceptions that you might have that will prevent, that make you think, you know, maybe this isn't the activity for me, are things like, you know, there, some people say BP is just a very rhetorical and stylistic activity. It isn't particularly technical. I think that has actually historically not really been true if you ask people who have really done both. And especially lately, it has become less true. If you watch any modern BP round, especially ones that were online post COVID, you can see that the activity has actually become considerably more technical than before and is much less flowery, if that's your concern. Though I think style still definitely does matter. And then the second is in terms of the kind of argumentation. I think for the most part, there is a lot of overlap here in that arguments that are well constructed, persuasive, hard to beat, and APDA are also likely going to be have those same characteristics in BP. So, you know, my advice for people who are starting out is to not overcorrect, right? If you are a competent APTA debater who makes good arguments, I would just start by making arguments that do feel familiar and strong to you. And then, you know, over time, as you take feedback, you can learn where you might need to slightly adjust. But I think something that I often see people fall into is to just like go way too far and then actually just not really do either speech particularly well. So yeah, just if you have done a fair amount of APTA up until this point, you are, I think, likely much further along on your like journey to BP than you might think you are. So some major differences between the two that I think are useful to note. The first is how the activity is judged. So in APTA, and I looked around for this, there's no like rule book. Like I looked all over the APTA website. Uh, and I think this is kind of like borne out by the fact that we have like a positive paradigms, right? There's like the paradigm project on the forum. And if you read these paradigms, the ways that people choose to interpret the rules of how APTA should be evaluated can vary greatly, right? Things like the extent to which you allow for new applications of arguments in PMR, whether that's new or not, or weighing, how sticky defense is from the MO into the LOR, right? Like different judges just think differently. On questions of theory, they also think very differently. So you have to compare norms when having this discussion of how judging is different. I'm going to talk about what I think kind of the median APTA judge is like, but importantly, APTA, it can be a little more variable in terms of the expectations of what you have from judges. Not to say that all judges in BP are perfect or the same, but at least there's a kind of standard, and I'll get into that later, that they are trying to approach. But going back to APTA, I think generally people kind of hold the idea that APTA is tabula rasa, which is some debate jargon that just says like, it should minimize judge intervention as much as possible, even to the point of not intervening against arguments that seem particularly unintuitive beyond the realm of reasonability. Just like you should just take what the debaters say and is written on your paper as gospel, and that is how you should evaluate it. I think that is kind of a very general summation of the a core norm of APTA, right? Minimizing judge intervention. BP, on the other hand, has a pretty codified judge manual that will change slightly over time or be clarified in some aspects. But for the most part, there is kind of a very clear and thorough discussion of how the activity is supposed to be evaluated. And then secondarily, I think the main difference is that as opposed to tabula rasa, judges in BP, by virtue of the fact that there is, you know, no rebuttal speech, and that, arguments from like OG doesn't get a chance to respond to CO, judges are more invited to consider how arguments interact beyond just how you claim they do. Whereas in APDA, because both teams get to just engage with each other completely, and there's no other need for the judge to kind of step in there. The judge just can maybe be a little less interventionist and turn their brain off a bit. That's one thing. The second is just kind of there is a standard of reasonability that is applied to arguments. So the burdens of proof are very different here, where just because you say, the sky is green, that does not necessarily mean the judge has to believe the sky is green, even if the other team doesn't say, actually, the sky is blue, right? So here's a good example that I think highlights that difference. So let's say there's the same motion in either format. This house supports the remilitarization of Japan. One team makes the argument, China views militarized Japan as a threat, and this means that there is a higher chance that nuclear war will happen. Let's say that on both formats, this argument is dropped and not responded to. How should the judge evaluate this argument? I think many people would say that in APDA, you should just evaluate it as it's given. So because it is dropped and there is no response, you evaluate the impact at the scale of the claim that is made, which is that nuclear war will happen. Even if the team doesn't give reasons or links to walk you through the story of how, increasing diplomatic tension leads to an increased chance of flashpoint conflict, leads to, some kind of increased chance that nuclear war will seem likely. They just kind of intuition pump the idea that, when you view something as a threat and you're a nuclear power, you're more likely to use a nuclear weapon, right? Like that's just the thing that's made. In BP, it would be evaluated pretty differently, right? You don't evaluate the impact at the scale of the claim. You evaluate the impact at the scale of the strength of the warrant underlying the claim, which in this case, that sentence there is barely even a sentence, barely even a warrant, right? Like maybe there's an implied warrant, but at most you could generously credit, like absent more warranting and filling in the links, that there is an increased diplomatic tension. And that's still something you can credit them, and presumably in other parts of their speech, they might have weighed why increased diplomatic tensions are bad. But that's probably the most that I think your median BP judge would be willing to credit the argument as it's presented here in the slide, right? Not to suggest that you couldn't make this argument such that it would be credited the same in both formats, but the extent to which you would have to prove the argument to do so in APDA would almost be redundant, right? That would be time that you could spend on other arguments, presumably, unless you're worried about the other team beating it, in which case, like, maybe it makes sense to flesh it out more. But for the most part, you just only have to overcome the extent to which the other team can pick up that you said this and respond to it. You don't have to worry about the judge maybe thinking that you haven't explained it enough. Whereas in BP, you have to consider, like, have I done this to the point where the judge thinks that I have feasibly proven the impact that I'm claiming is actually an impact that I have proved happens through sufficient warranting, rather than just saying impact happens. Second major difference then is the extent to which theory affects the round. Theory meaning like just debating about debate. So APDA definitely has a lot more theory debate in it, right? Just by virtue of being case debate, sometimes cases are unfair, and then that leads to tight calls happening where you just say, that case is unfair, drop the other team, right? But aside from tight calls, I think APDA has a growing amount of other kind of pre-fiat argumentation. And what I mean by that is argumentation that is not germane to the motion or the round, right? So like after the motion happens, arguments about what happens in like the debate world we're talking about. These are arguments that happen outside of the debate world. So for example, arguments like the other team did not content warn something and therefore they should lose are pre-fiat because they are not arguments about what happens in the debate world and things you should consider there, in the hypothetical world we're talking about. They're arguments about in this world that we live in outside of the debate, you should still consider the impacts of those, because those matter more than the debate hypothetical we're talking about. Now, I'm not going to talk about, my thoughts on this, but what I will say is that, arguments of that nature, things like Ks, which also don't really happen that much in APDA, but occasionally do, or RVIs, or even specific arguments that happen in tight calls, oftentimes are not appeals to the rules, but are appeals to a kind of role of the ballot argumentation outside of the rules, where the judge should care less about who won the round and more about implications outside the round, right? So a lot of theory argumentation exists that appeals to that kind of intuition. BP, on the other hand, they don't even really call it like theory, but there is some extent of, just talking about the debate, but that all happens one within the grounds of just kind of like what the manual says, right? Just the specific rules of the round, and less about other implications outside of the rules of the round. And then secondarily, the takeaway the judge should get from these argumentations is never like, because of this, there was a norm you should set, they should drop the team, right? So for example, if you squirrel a motion in APDA, it would be very reasonable for me as the other team to say, they squirreled the motion, novice debaters can't engage with this and they'll lose. So you shouldn't just interpret the motion in a way that's fair to make the round happen. You should drop gov, because the harm of unretaining novices when you cheat like this is bad. That is an argument that is much more at home in APDA. Whereas in BP, if someone squirrels the motion, you just say like, therefore we should interpret the motion in a more reasonable way. Or if someone knifes, you just say the arguments that knifed shouldn't be considered, but not because they knifed, they're an auto fourth, right? And I think BP very much time and time again makes it very clear that there are no like punitive penalties for breaking the rules, right? Like you'll often hear at the start of a BP tournament, there are no auto fourths, right? So violating the rules only affects your argumentation to the extent that that argumentation was relevant to your case, but are not like auto losses or anything. Whereas in APDA, I think you can make claims to suggest that something would be an auto loss. So much less theory happens in BP. Much less theory will be acceptable by your judge, even if you try to make those arguments. They'll just generally be less persuasive, and that as a norm, they just don't happen, which I think is very much probably what you should care about the most. Like a lot of people haven't read the rules of APDA or BP, but just kind of go along the norms of what they understand. So even if you think like, oh, my interpretation of the WADC judge manual is that you should buy my pre-fiat argumentation, like your judges just like won't buy it, right? So I would try to steer clear of that if that is something you enjoy. And if that is what you like most about debate, then maybe BP isn't for you if you like that kind of, winning through that kind of pre-fiat argumentation, which, not my cup of tea, but whatever floats your boat. Cool. What counts as an argument? I kind of covered this earlier in terms of judging. So it might be a bit redundant. You need a necessary level of warranting, whereas in APDA, you can take kind of any link in a storm, right? The links have to be particularly good or persuasive and pretty thorough in BP. You can't win off of something just being a blip or a pull through. So just because something isn't unresponded to, that doesn't make it true. And importantly, this applies, and I'll get to this in the strategy later, if people make like 8 unpersuasive claims that could be round winning if unresponded to an APDA, in BP, it's probably strategic to just generally characterize them as like unpersuasive and move on, rather than beat them at the link level argument by argument. So you can kind of focus more on your own argumentation and weighing, as opposed to rebutting every little thing that the other team says. So that's kind of like another difference. Whereas APDA is a much more line by line format, where you do kind of want to make sure that you have a on the flow response to every single thing the other team said, because you're worried something might be dropped. Those drops are much less terminal in BP. The second thing is on reasonability. So, the more kind of out there the claim you're trying to make is, probably the more that the judge will impose some kind of burden of proof. And there's a lot of debate, and different judges have different bars, as with all formats, not a perfect like AI is evaluating the round, but generally, I think if an argument just kind of stretches the realm of reasonability, it requires too much suspension of disbelief. I think judges in BP are much less likely to take those with much weight in the round. And then I think that the extent to which this like affects you as a debater is probably overblown by a lot of APTA debaters. Like, I think judges are pretty willing to take most arguments so long as they're proven. This really only applies to things that are like really out there, like something like the world will end if this happens, or arguments to that effect for rounds that really aren't about anything that could feasibly lead to the world ending. I think that this is just a guardrail against those kinds of arguments, which I think have much more of a home in APTA. And then finally, just kind of a question of topicality. A good example that always comes to mind, I think, is Harvard 2018 APTA. There was this motion about how we should pass a constitutional amendment to abolish Supreme Court's ability to review the constitutionality of federal laws. Intuitively, this seems much like a criminal justice law round. But I remember one team on APTA just went all in for why when you do this, then the conservative Supreme Court won't be able to stop the like EPA or some kind of executive orders that could happen to reduce climate change. And then because climate change could kill everyone, you should vote for guns. And then they won off of that. Right? Like that is something that is probably not exactly where the round had in mind. Other examples are, though I think this is also a bit of a change in norm. There was an argument or Cape Town World's partial double octos. A lot of people saw as a round about regulation over agriculture. But one team that I saw that I think in hindsight, I think maybe more judges would think ran an argument about animal welfare that a lot of judges just like almost laughed out of the round and didn't consider, right? Because it wasn't there. I think that trend is probably changing a bit, but just as someone who tries to sometimes like horseshoe in like finance in rounds where finance has no place as a strategy that worked really well for me in APTA, something that I needed to kind of like curb against in BP more. So just arguments that have their place for the round, round where the topic is relevant to those arguments, are just like considered BP. Okay, lastly, some miscellaneous norms and stylistic differences. Kind of two things. The first is that POIs, which do exist in APTA, actually, I've seen a lot of people be like confused when something stands up. They're unlike an APTA where you are not penalized or expected. It's almost foreign to take and offer them. In BP, they are expected if not required. I think if you don't take one, you don't auto lose. But it is much more unstrategic to not take one, and judges are much more actively incentivized to penalize you and assume that if you did not take a POI when one was offered, that it was an absolutely devastating POI, and that they should find much more of your case suspicious because of that. That's the first thing. The second is that speed. It's a little slower than an APTA, though I think these days that is probably less true. And it is much more about speech structure than the speed itself, in that I think there is just a lot more signposting because of the norms around clarity, such that even though people are fast in BP, they intentionally structure to their judge what they're doing and why. Whereas in APTA, I think people just kind of go like, 18 arguments rapid fire down the flow, because they have a PMR that can clean it up and explain how the arguments apply to each other. It's much easier to just go like argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, argument 4 without like really signposting. Like I've noticed that signposting is kind of a dying art in APTA. Also, people have like off-time roadmaps that don't exist in BP that have also made it such that the speech itself is very much just like, here are like 18 arguments I thought of. We don't have that luxury in BP to kind of structure your speech off time, and also you don't have the ability to like reconstruct the round after often. Your speech needs to kind of like be internally coherent and structured from the jump, because you don't have the ability to clean it up later. So yes, I think when people say speed is a problem in APDA, I think more what they're saying is that the structure combined with the speed makes it much harder for judges to understand what's happening. So when people apply that structure to BP, judges can find it kind of foreign or off-putting, just because it isn't presented in the way that they understand. So slowing down, good. Signposting, also really important, given that you don't have off-ramps. The major takeaway here, though, is that BP and APDA are symbiotic. I just want to stress that again, because I just gave like a bunch of reasons that they're different. But I do think I want to reiterate the pitch here, which is that those differences are what make each activity useful towards getting better at the other activity. Like, I do think if you're a BP debater, trying some APDA is useful. It encourages line-by-line coverage in a world where a lot of BP debaters are just kind of not really engaging with the other team beyond trying to outframe them. Actually responding to the warrants beyond just giving parallel analysis is something that I think APDA teaches, right? On your feet argument generation, case building. These are all things that I think APDA is great at for people who want to be better at BP. And then similarly, I think if you're an APDA debater, right, the takeaway you should get away from this is like, as you do more BP, you learn how to have better round vision in your speech without needing to, try to get a Hail Mary in the rebuttal. Oftentimes when I'm judging a round, I'll explain how the round broke down, where a team was losing in the first 4 constructive speeches, and then I'll get asked at the end, like, is there anything I could have done in PMR to just like have won the round despite having been drastically losing the round in the first 2 speeches? And like, yeah, like I always give some feedback about like things they could do better, but like what I really want to tell them that like might be too hurtful at the time is like, you should have been able to see this coming, right? Like, you should have been able to know the holes in your case in your PM or MG before it got to PMR. And BP puts you in that kind of do or die scenario where you don't have the safety net of a PMR or an LOR to bail you out of rounds when you realize like, oh no, my argument was like not proven, I'm going to like lie about the argument I gave. Or like, oh no, I didn't weigh, I'm going to give new arguments that I'll just say are like weighing, or something like that, right? Like, you don't want to be in that position, and BP doesn't let you be in that position. If you're opening government and your PM misses something, or and DPM also doesn't, give argumentation to preempt a very obvious hole in your case, the DLO is more than able to just absolutely eat you alive, and it's not like backloading, right? Like, they just pointed out a very obvious hole that you should have filled and then just crushed you. It forces you to be a lot more preemptive and a lot more aware of like, what is the other team likely going to do? What are the holes in my own case that I need to fill that I don't have the luxury of filling after the fact? So I actually think that it is a immensely useful skill there, 1. 2, scaling your impacts, and that's just kind of like a catch-all for like making better arguments from the jump. So you have a back half, right, that can just point out that you did the APDA thing of just trying to make your claim the impact an argument, but you don't prove it. The back half keeps you honest, right? So that makes you just better at giving the argument such that the team behind you can't just exploit the hole in your case as well. Oftentimes you can win in APDA, but with low speaks, you almost won by default because the other team just was worse than you, but that doesn't mean you were good, right? And having another team to give a better version of your case almost forces you to give the best version of your arguments, which is great if you want speaks, right? In a format like APDA where speaks are like incredibly important to your performance at the tournament. Having that to keep you honest is another useful skill. And then finally, just prioritizing weighing and framing, not over relying on rebuttal and pull-throughs, is just another skill that BP very much encourages. So what are some cross-transferable skills? What are things you can take from your APDA experience that will help you in BP? So let's talk. I broke this up into two halves, opening and closing. For opening half, it's pretty similar, right? Absent the rebuttal speeches to an APDA motions round, right? The PM and the LO, just like one speech gives the arguments, the other speech responds to those and gives their own arguments, right? And then the second speeches are kind of similar to rebuttal speeches, right? They're unlike the member speeches, which are very line by line, given that this is the last speech your team has, they're much more crystallized, much more weighing, much more, you're also allowed to add new arguments. So it is much less line by line. And then also, if you remember the way that this format is judged, you don't really need to respond to everything the other team says. You can just very much focus on weighing the important stuff in the round. So what are some skills you can take with you here, aside from the fact that there are some similarities? One is your case writing skills for the important framing and characterization that is especially important for like a PM and an LO, but all speakers probably can often benefit from being good at framing characterization. So why I think APT is actually really good here is that oftentimes when people write cases, what makes the case strong is not the actual PMC, but is actually the background and the caveats, right? Like the reason so many APTA PMCs can just be like argument 1, argument 2, argument 3 with no like world building is because that world building is already given in background. So you can kind of just like, there's already context for your arguments and why they matter, right? But that's actually an advantage to you if you're an APTA debater who's written a lot of cases. All you have to remember is that unlike an APTA PMC, you kind of also want to put POCs as part of your speech almost, right? Like that context that is advantageous to you should be part of your speech now, given that you don't have the ability to have it off time. That's one thing. The second is, it's a little different in that you have fiat completely to shape the world how you want in APTA, but that's like a very small change, right? All you have to do is the framing and characterization that makes your case so strong, just like explain why that's likely or true. And if it is intuitive framing about the world, for example, if it's like intuitive what a religion's tenets are, or intuitive what an actor would want, this is where the BP judging actually works in your favor, right? Because whereas in APTA motions, if you did not frame something, the other team can just counter assert your characterization. If you're actually making reasonable persuasive arguments here and reasonable persuasive framing and characterization, your judge is just kind of like more likely to buy it, and the other team can't just counter assert, and then your judge just says, "Oops, it's a wash on the flow," right? Like if your framing characterization is actually strong and intuitive. So people who are good case writers, people who can see where there are argumentative tricks maybe, or burdens that they can kind of fill for themselves really easily just from the framing. People who are good at that, I think, are just like naturally going to be good at giving first speeches in BP, so long as they remember that the things that they take for granted off time and POCs, they just build into here, right? Like if you just ask yourself, if I were running this motion as a case, what would I caveat to make the case almost tight? And then just like explain why those things you would caveat are true. And that's like a very easy like shortcut into figuring out how to do good framing and good characterization. So that's the first kind of like trick. And I think this also applies to APTA motions as well. The second is what I was mentioning earlier, which is that like you are good at line by line because the format you have done has forced you to. And BP is a format that is increasingly more technical and cares about those kinds of responses. I've talked to a lot of judges who are like pretty frustrated by teams who just like don't really engage with the other team, but just try to frame them out and then run their own arguments and weigh them. Oftentimes, direct rebuttal and just like crushing the other team's most important warrants is something that activators I also think are uniquely good at. I think activators can sometimes tend to do too much of this and respond to everything, but at least that skill of like being able to identify how an argument is structured and what it needs to be proven, and then just like annihilate it with like 4 responses. For all of you natural LOs out there who give very fast, techy APDA LOs, those skills come in super handy here, and I think will differentiate you from a lot of teams who just kind of like run their own arguments in a vacuum and are loath to engage. This is kind of where you can shine more. A lot of teams probably are less prepared to handle just kind of that almost like spamming of like flipping or turning arguments and beating arguments at the warrant level. Cool. Closing half, I think a way to approach this is if you were someone who was judged a lot of APDA, like I said earlier, and you were like, man, like I guess Gov won, but like they kind of almost won by default. Here's like a bunch of things they could have done better, arguments I think would have been better. The things that you like don't want to say in your OA or RFD unless they ask for feedback, but like are in the back of your head where you're just like, why didn't you do all these things? You didn't prove any of this. That skill of being able to like evaluate the round on the flow, the kind of like just that judging skill, I think does come in really handy here for closing half, because it's basically like you just watch like truncated APDA round, and then you have to point out, you know, what's something that the team could have done better. Well, why is that so important to what the team is trying to prove, and how are you able to do that better? I think for people who've done a lot of APDA, I think this is like a good way to approach it. I think closing half can almost seem pretty intimidating to debaters at first, because it's like pretty foreign from APDA. Like it's just a very different skill to do like bench weighing, for example, to explain why like, you know, we're on the same side, but CG matters more than OG. But I think if you kind of like go into it with this mindset, that can kind of make it seem a lot less intimidating, right? Because like you've seen APDA rounds that like, you know, teams could have just done something better on, and I think that that's kind of like all this is, right? Like it isn't like some like just like very unclear target of like what I need to do to have my extension count, which I think is sometimes the intimidating part, where it's like you don't really know what the goalposts are. But the goalposts I think are actually pretty clear, right? It's just if there is something that was wrong with the other team's case, pointing out why that was important and explaining how you were able to do that is really all you need to do here. The second thing is I think like you know, APDA, though with prep this has become less of a stressed skill in APDA, but still I think there is a degree of kind of on the fly argumentation that APDA teaches, and I think for closing half especially, that kind of creativity that you have from, you know, making arguments that, you know, in a world without the reasonability standard, a lot of teams kind of just are more able to be creative, I think, when you come from APDA. You're less kind of like boxed in by the really stock arguments that kind of are the same arguments that people in BP are always running. I think oftentimes you can see something a little more out there or creative when you have kind of practiced that skill from APDA. So I'd invite you on closing to think of, you know, this is kind of where you can be, you have a little more leeway in terms of running that stuff that might seem a little kind of like out there to your initial judge. Yeah. All right, so that was the lecture. You can also always contact me on Facebook if you have any questions. I'm always trying to get more people from APDA to try BP. I think it's really, really useful and also just a lot of fun.